it's fascinating. You talked there about what the democracies have to do to hold something in common, and since
stop pressing Israel for
well, that for sure. But I think
it's my commercial.
But beyond that, I think that the real question for the West is what actually is held in common anymore. So when it was facing down a communist threat, it was easy to say what we hold in common is that systems of private property and voting are better than alternatives. Now there's been this attempt to say, well, what we're fighting on behalf of is democracy, but just democracy, not necessarily private property, not necessarily free markets, just voting. And that's not going to get you very far, because the simple fact of the matter is that is a methodology that can be used on behalf of anything. I mean, Hamas was an elected body in 2006, and they're a terrorist group in the Gaza Strip firing missiles routinely into the middle of Israel. So the question becomes, what are the values that the West holds if it's not going to be some sort of economic solidarity around private property, because you don't have an opponent like the Soviet Union to face off against? And it seems like what it should be and what it could be would be an understanding of traditional culture that has animated each one of these individual nations in combination with democracy and free markets, right? But everybody's been attempting to internationalize everything.
That's what the Queen of England stood for so long.
Exactly, and we've been robbing each of these nations of tradition, because the transnational empire that was fighting the Soviets was the laissez-faire empire, let's say, that was fighting the Soviet communist empire. And the Soviet empire collapses. And now the laissez-faire empire no longer exists, and so the imperial sort of attitude that's arisen in the West is a cultural imperialism. It's an imperialism of the atomistic individualism. It's an idea that what lies at the root of each one of us is our desire to do whatever it is that we want to do,
and that
states are
hell with everything else.
Exactly, and states are a threat to that, and nationalities are a threat to that. And if we just get rid of that, then we'll have the wonderful George Soros open society that he's been seeking for so long, and that will be the new empire. But that's not an empire. That's nothing. That's collapse. And so
this won't hold.
Right.
If you don't have the fabric of commonality, of common values, the greatest empires collapse. I mean, Soviet Union collapsed. I did a conference on terror after my brother died in February. So 3 years later, I organized an international conference on terrorism, and I invited Vladimir Bukovsky, who was the great Russian dissident who exposed the use of psychiatric wards
to treat political
to suppress political dissent. He had been exchanged for some spy, for some communist spy, and he came to Jerusalem. He said to me this in 1979. He said, the Soviet Union would collapse in a decade. He said, everything is rotten there, and people have lost their faith. They no longer believe in it. So it's bound to collapse. And I think what you're saying, Ben, is that in the absence of a common fabric of belief and faith, that
it's fatal.
This thing doesn't work. And when I talked about the Iron Triangle of peace, of economic, military, and diplomatic power, the center of the triangle is your faith and your core beliefs. Because otherwise, what are you fighting for?
And that's one of the things that's so noticeable over here. I mean, so one of my security guys here is Chiluni, which means secular in English. He's a secular Jewish guy, grew up on a kibbutz, but he still has tremendous reverence for Jewish tradition, for example. He had two grandmothers who survived the Holocaust and were not religious, anti-religious in many ways because they had survived the Holocaust, but they still had reverence for a certain level of tradition. And that tradition manifests in Israel, even for people who are secular, in the army, really, is in solidarity against external foes and in understanding that you're part of a chain of history. And that's something that we completely lack in the United States now. I mean, that solidarity has been largely removed in large swaths of the United States, and I feel like the same thing is happening.
Well, and there's an insistence in the U.S. that the traditions that bind us are actually part of the oppressive problem.
Well, because George Washington was a slave owner, don't you know? So, I mean, the attempt to reconstitute the past in precisely the prism of the moment is odd. It's funny. It's stupid. And I think political...
It's not just stupid. It's malevolent, too.
Well, it's political...
It's not just ignorance.
Political correctness gone AWOL. It's crazy. It's too far. And I think...
I wrote a manifesto that I published on YouTube and distributed fairly widely on a conservative manifesto trying to outline a vision of common tradition, I would say, that could provide the basis for that kind of union of the West that you described. When I traveled through Eastern Europe pretty extensively for the first few months of this year, and I was struck constantly, having the great privilege to meet a variety of political and cultural leaders in each country, with two things. One, that they were absolutely appalled at the wave of proto-communist ideas that were sweeping over the West, and stunned to the degree that that they had achieved dominance. And then also this belief that they were lone voices crying in the wilderness, which is what you hear from conservatives in many, many places. And I thought, well, after going to 10 different countries and hearing exactly the same thing in every country, I thought, well, why in the world isn't there something like an international movement on the conservative front?
Comintern.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the danger, of course, of that happening. But by the same token, the people who are espousing traditional values haven't done a very good job of articulating them, and they haven't been able to bring anything approximated a united front with a vision that can combat the vision that the progressives purport to put forward.
I think that given the state of our educational systems and the obvious tilt of the mainstream media in most countries, most Western countries, the only way that you actually get a corrective is by being mugged. You have to be mugged by semi-socialist or socialist policies. You have to be mugged by defunding the police. You have to be. That's the only way it works. You know, it's like you forget, and you have to be reminded what are the fundamentals of a free society.
Yeah. Well, then the question is, how hard do you have to be mugged, or do you have to be raped?
Look, I think it's avoidable, but you have to have leaders who are willing to pay with their political blood to correct. I mean, I couldn't move Israel into a free market revolution without effectively putting myself on the line of fire, going down in my political
Did you know that was going to happen?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You knew
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how were you able to get away with it, so to speak? Or why were you able to garner the support within the ranks of your own people? Or did you not?
Because for Sharon, it was very good. I was the guy. I was the guy who was going into the operating room and sawing off limbs, doing all these things. And you know, if it succeeds, he gets the credit. If it fails, I'm the scapegoat. And you remove an heir apparent. Also, I had.
Okay.
But so I had it was a moment in time. I had a free market coalition that because of the depth of the crisis was so, the economic crisis was so bad that I could take these extraordinary.
So what do you think is going to happen in Europe?
But in a way, that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
Is that sometimes the corrective, it's not always true, but sometimes the corrective requires a crisis.